I arrived home from my business trip a day early, expecting to surprise my wife. Instead, I found her crumpled at the bottom of our grand staircase, bleeding and sobbing softly, fighting for her life. The house was supposed to be empty except for her. But as I knelt beside her, my hands trembling, as I reached for my phone to call 911, I heard it. Clinking glasses, roaring laughter. It was coming from my own kitchen. My son and his in-laws were having a party, mere feet away from where my wife lay dying. I did not scream right away. I let the paramedics tell me the horrifying truth, and then I made sure my son regretted the day he was born. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from, in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family betrayal is the worst kind of poison. My name is Grant Whitaker, and I am 71 years old. I spent 40 years of my life building a career as a logistics director, working 60-hour weeks so my family would never know the sting of poverty. My wife Eleanor and I built our sprawling suburban home from the ground up. It was our sanctuary, a 5-bedroom estate with a wraparound porch and a beautiful oak staircase in the foyer. We had intended to spend our golden years there in total peace. But a year ago, our 35-year-old son Trevor came to us with a familiar sob story. He and his wife Vanessa were struggling. Rent was too high. His business ventures were stalling, and they just needed a place to stay for a few months to save up for their own home. Eleanor, with her endless well of maternal grace, insisted we take them in. I had my reservations, but I loved my wife and I loved my son, so I opened my doors. Last Thursday, I was supposed to be in Cleveland, wrapping up a consulting contract. I managed to finish the negotiations early and decided to catch an evening flight back. I did not call Eleanor. I wanted to see her face light up when I walked through the door. I took a cab from the airport, enjoying the quiet hum of the suburban streets as I pulled into our driveway. The lights were on in the back of the house, which I assumed meant Eleanor was watching her evening shows. I unlocked the front door, quietly dropping my suitcase on the thick entryway rug. I was smiling. That smile is something I will never get back. The foyer was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. As I took off my coat, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. It was a whimper, a sound of absolute helpless agony. I froze. My blood ran cold in my veins. I turned toward the grand oak staircase, and my heart stopped beating. Eleanor was lying at the bottom of the stairs. Her body was contorted at an unnatural angle. One of her legs was twisted, her hip clearly shattered, but it was her face that broke me. There was a dark pool of blood staining the cream-colored rug beneath her head. Her eyes were half closed, glazed over with pain and shock. She was shivering, her pale, frail fingers clutching at the bottom step, as if she had been trying to pull herself up for hours. "Eleanor," I gasped, my voice cracking into a sob. I fell to my knees beside her, my hands hovering over her broken body, terrified that touching her would cause her more pain. "Grant," she breathed, her voice so weak it sounded like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "It hurts. It hurts so much." I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, screaming at the operator to send an ambulance immediately. I took off my jacket and draped it over her shivering shoulders. I promised her she would be okay, brushing the hair away from her bleeding forehead. As I leaned in close to hear her shallow breathing, another sound echoed through the hallway. It was laughter. Loud, booming, careless laughter. I looked up, my eyes tracking the sound. It was coming from the kitchen just down the hall. I heard the unmistakable pop of a wine cork, followed by a woman's shrill giggle. It was Vanessa. And then I heard Trevor's voice, loud and jovial, telling a joke. My wife was lying here with a shattered hip and a bleeding head, and my son was having a party. The sheer absurdity of the situation paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. How could they not hear her? How could they not know? I held Eleanor's hand, feeling the icy chill of her skin, and a dark, terrifying rage began to build in the pit of my stomach. I stood up, leaving Eleanor for just a moment, as the distant wail of sirens began to echo down our street. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I pushed open the double doors to the kitchen, and the scene before me felt like a cruel hallucination. Trevor and Vanessa were sitting at the marble island. Across from them were Vanessa's parents, Gerald and Marlene. The kitchen island was covered in an extravagant charcuterie board, artisan cheeses, cured meats, and expensive crackers. In Trevor's hand was a bottle of my vintage Cabernet, a $200 bottle I had been saving for my anniversary. They were toasting. "What the hell is going on here?" I roared. My voice bounced off the tile walls, so loud it rattled the wine glasses. Trevor jumped, nearly dropping the bottle. Vanessa let out a startled shriek, and Gerald and Marlene stared at me like deer caught in headlights. "Dad," Trevor stammered, his face turning pale. "You are home early." We are having a little get-together to celebrate Gerald's promotion." I did not care about Gerald's promotion. I did not care about the wine. I pointed a trembling finger down the hallway. "Your mother is bleeding to death at the bottom of the stairs," I screamed, my voice breaking. "She fell. She has been screaming for help. How could you sit here drinking my wine while she is dying?" Trevor's eyes widened in exaggerated horror. "What? Mom fell? We did not hear a thing." He looked at Vanessa, playing the part of the shocked, devastated son perfectly. "Dad, I swear, the music was playing and we were talking. We had no idea." He rushed past me into the hallway, performing a theatrical display of panic as he knelt near Eleanor. "Mom, oh my God. Mom, hold on." Vanessa followed, covering her mouth with her hands, putting on a mask of concern that made my stomach turn. The paramedics burst through the front door a moment later. They pushed Trevor aside and immediately went to work on Eleanor, stabilizing her neck and carefully loading her onto a backboard. I stood out of their way, watching them hook up IV lines and check her vitals. Trevor stood next to me, gripping his hair, putting on a masterful show of a son in distress. But then one of the older paramedics stood up and pulled off his gloves. He looked at me, his expression grave and filled with a quiet, judgmental anger. "Are you the husband?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice, so only I could hear. "The blood on her forehead is completely dried," he muttered. "Her core temperature has dropped significantly. Sir, she has been lying on this floor for at least 3 hours. 3 hours. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 3 hours. They had been in the kitchen barely 50 feet away, drinking my wine and eating cheese while my wife bled on the floor for 3 hours. They did not just fail to hear her, they ignored her. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing red lights and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Eleanor was rushed straight into emergency surgery to repair her shattered hip and relieve the pressure from the hematoma on her head. I sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, staring at my blood-stained hands. Trevor and Vanessa arrived an hour later. Trevor threw his arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder. "Dad, I am so sorry," he cried, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I should have checked on her. I feel terrible. I am the worst son in the world." As I let him hug me, feeling the rigid, tense posture of his body, a flood of memories washed over me. This was not the first time Trevor had played the victim to escape accountability. When he crashed my car at 17, he cried just like this, claiming the brakes failed. When he dropped out of college, after I paid his tuition in full, he wept, saying the pressure was destroying his mental health. When his first business went bankrupt, leaving him drowning in debt, I bailed him out, while he sobbed about being targeted by bad partners. Every single time, I stepped in. I paid the bills. I fixed the problems. I shielded him from the consequences of his own actions. But this was not a dented fender or a failed business. This was my wife. This was his mother. I realized in that cold waiting room that my son was not a victim of bad luck or poor timing. He was a parasite. He and Vanessa had treated my home like a luxury hotel, and they had treated Eleanor like an inconvenience. The paramedics' words echoed in my mind. 3 hours. They knew she was there. They just did not care enough to stop their party. My instinct was to grab him by the collar, to throw him against the hospital wall, and demand the truth. But 40 years in corporate logistics had taught me one vital lesson. If you want to destroy an enemy, you do not show them your weapons. You let them believe they have won. You let them get comfortable. I slowly wrapped my arms around Trevor, returning his fake embrace with one of my own. I patted his back, forcing my voice to sound weak, fragile, and utterly defeated. "It is okay, Trevor," I whispered, choking out a sob I did not feel. "I know it was an accident. I know you would never let anything happen to your mother. We are just going to pray she pulls through." Trevor pulled back, wiping his dry eyes, a subtle glimmer of relief flashing across his face. "Yes, Dad. We will be right here with you." He turned to comfort Vanessa, and I sat back down in the plastic chair. I lowered my head into my hands, playing the part of the broken, naive old man perfectly. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought I was just a senile fool who believed their lies. Let them think it. Deep inside, the sorrow was replaced by something far colder. A silent, calculating determination. I was going to find out exactly what they had been doing in my house. And when I had the proof, I was not just going to kick them out. I was going to dismantle their lives piece by piece. The silent adjustment had begun. I drove back to the house the next morning, while my wife was still sleeping off the effects of the anesthesia. The drive felt completely different in the cold light of day. The suburban streets I used to love, the neighborhood we chose because it was safe and quiet, now looked gray and lifeless. When I unlocked the front door, the silence of the house hit me like a physical blow. It was a suffocating, heavy silence. The lingering smell of expensive cheese and stale wine still hung in the air from the night before, a sickening reminder of the party they threw while she suffered. I walked past the kitchen without looking inside. I could not bear to see the remnants of their celebration, the empty bottles and dirty plates left behind by people who had no souls. My only goal was to pack a bag for Eleanor. She needed her comfortable nightgowns, her warm slippers, and the small framed photo of us from our trip to Key West that she always kept on her nightstand. I walked up the stairs, forcing myself to look away from the dark stain on the cream-colored rug at the bottom step. My heart physically ached when I saw it. I went into our bedroom and pulled a small overnight bag from the closet. As I carefully folded her soft cotton gowns, I thought about how fragile she looked in that sterile hospital bed. I thought about the doctors telling me how close she came to not making it through the night. They told me that if she had been found even an hour later, her heart would have given out from the shock and the massive blood loss. She had been freezing, terrified, and in unimaginable pain. I zipped up her bag and placed it by the bedroom door. I was about to leave to get back to the safety of the hospital and hold her hand when a sudden thought stopped me in my tracks. The security cameras. 2 years ago, After a string of burglaries in our normally quiet neighborhood, I had installed a top-of-the-line security system. I put discreet cameras in the main hallways, the living room, and pointing toward the front and back doors. When Trevor and Vanessa moved in to save money, Trevor complained about them constantly. He said it felt like an invasion of privacy. He told me he could not relax in his own childhood home, knowing his father was watching his every move. Because I wanted peace in my house, I told him I would turn them off, and I did turn off the main hub in the living room. Trevor even went as far as unplugging the router connected to that hub a few months later, thinking he was being clever and covering his tracks. But working in corporate logistics for 40 years teaches you a few things about redundancy and fail-safes. You never leave a critical system without a backup. I never told my son about the secondary cloud backup I had routed through a completely separate network hidden in my home office. He thought he had blinded the house, but the house never stopped watching. It recorded every single second. I walked down the hall and unlocked the heavy wooden door to my home office. The room was cold and dark. I sat down at my mahogany desk and woke up my computer monitor. My hands hovered over the keyboard, shaking uncontrollably. A part of me did not want to open the program. A part of me desperately wanted to live in the blissful ignorance of believing my son was just a careless fool who made a terrible mistake. I wanted to believe they simply had the music too loud. But the cold, rational part of my brain, the part that solved problems for a living, knew I needed the absolute truth. I needed to see exactly what happened in the hours I was gone. I logged into the secure server and pulled up the hallway camera feed from the night before. I typed in the timestamp, starting from 6 in the evening. The screen flickered to life. I saw the empty hallway. I saw the warm afternoon light slowly fading into the long evening shadows. I clicked the fast-forward button, watching the time tick by in the corner of the screen. 7 o'clock passed. 8 o'clock passed. Then at 8:15, there she was. Eleanor stepped into the frame. She was wearing her favorite blue sweater, the one I bought her for her birthday. She was walking slowly toward the stairs, holding a small plastic laundry basket. She looked so happy. She looked so peaceful in her own home, completely unaware that her life was about to shatter. I watched my screen with bated breath, knowing exactly what was coming, but completely powerless to reach through the screen and stop it. As Eleanor reached the top of the stairs, her foot caught on the slightly raised edge of the carpet runner. It was a simple, stupid misstep. I watched in absolute horror as my beautiful wife lost her balance. The laundry basket flew from her hands, clothes scattering everywhere. She reached out desperately to grab the wooden handrail, but her fingers slipped right off the polished wood. She tumbled backward. I had to bite my own fist to stop from screaming out loud as I watched her fall down the entire flight of stairs. Her body hit the hard wooden steps over and over again until she reached the bottom landing with a sickening, silent impact on the video feed. She lay there completely motionless for a few terrifying seconds before her body began to writhe in agony. I could see her mouth opening in a scream, calling out for her son, calling out for anyone to help her. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision, but I forced myself to keep watching. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 1 minute passed, then 2 long minutes. Then the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open. Vanessa stepped out into the hallway. She was holding a half-full wine glass. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Eleanor writhing on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Vanessa did not drop her glass in shock. She did not run to comfort my wife. She did not pull out her phone to call for an ambulance. Instead, Vanessa took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward. She stood right over Eleanor, looking down at her bleeding mother-in-law with absolutely zero emotion on her face. I reached out with a trembling hand, and turned up the audio feed on the computer, pushing the volume to the maximum level. The sound of Eleanor sobbing filled my quiet office, breaking my heart into a million pieces. "Please," Eleanor begged, her voice weak and trembling with raw pain. "Help me. Call an ambulance. I cannot move my leg. I am bleeding." Vanessa took a slow sip of her red wine. She looked down at Eleanor with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She actually rolled her eyes. "Do not be dramatic," Vanessa said. Her voice was cold, flat, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "Do not be dramatic." She repeated those words as if my wife had just spilled a glass of water on the rug, not shattered her hip and cracked her skull open. Vanessa turned around, the fabric of her expensive silk dress swishing around her legs. She walked right back through the kitchen doors, leaving my wife bleeding on the floor alone. She did not even look back. A moment later, the audio on the camera picked up a massive surge in volume. Vanessa had gone back into the kitchen and turned the music up. She turned the bass up so loud that it vibrated through the floorboards. She turned it up specifically to drown out the sound of my wife crying for her life. I sat in my chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer malice of what I had just witnessed. My mind raced, piecing together the grim reality of the situation. Vanessa went back into that kitchen. She sat back down with her parents and my son. There is no possible way she kept that a secret from him. They must have known. They sat there drinking my expensive wine, eating their fancy food, and listening to the muffled cries of the woman who gave that boy life. This was not a case of young people having too much fun and neglecting their surroundings. This was a calculated, deliberate choice. They saw her bleeding. They knew she was severely injured, and they purposely left her there on the floor like discarded trash. They turned up the music and poured more wine, hoping the problem would simply resolve itself. They wanted her to die. They wanted her out of the way so they could claim this house and everything we owned for themselves. The realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. All the warmth, all the paternal love I had ever felt for Trevor evaporated in an instant. My own son and his wife wanted my Eleanor dead. I reached over and closed the laptop, the screen going black. The grieving, confused father was gone forever. In his place was a man who would not rest, who would not sleep until he had burned their entire world to the ground. They wanted to play a game with my family. Now they were going to learn what happens when you awaken a monster. I sat in the dark for a long time after closing the laptop. The silence in my home office felt completely different now. It was no longer a place of peace. It was a crime scene. I needed to focus. Eleanor was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life, and the doctors needed her complete medical history and advance directives to proceed with her surgeries. I kept all our vital documents locked away in the floor safe, hidden beneath the Persian rug near my mahogany desk. I stood up, and my knees ached. The adrenaline that had surged through my veins while watching that horrific video was beginning to fade, leaving behind a cold and hollow exhaustion. I looked around the room, taking in the framed photographs on the walls. There was a picture of Trevor when he was 7 years old, sitting right at this desk, wearing my oversized reading glasses and pretending to review important papers. I had been so proud of him. I had spent my entire life trying to build a legacy that he could be proud of. I wanted to give him the security I never had growing up. I walked over to the corner of the room and pushed the heavy leather armchair out of the way. I rolled back the thick woven rug to reveal the square steel plate embedded in the floorboards. I reached down to lift the metal cover, but my fingers brushed against something sharp. I turned on the small brass desk lamp to get a better look. There were deep, jagged scratches gouged into the polished wood around the safe. Tiny metal shavings glittered in the dim light. My heart gave a strange, painful flutter. I knelt on the floor and pulled the cover back. The digital keypad was completely smashed. Someone had taken a heavy tool, probably a hammer or a crowbar from my own garage, and battered the electronic lock until the plastic casing cracked open. The emergency keyhole beneath it had been forced wide open. The heavy steel door was not even locked. It was resting loosely on its hinges, slightly ajar. I pulled the heavy door open, the metal groaning in the quiet room. A wave of pure panic washed over me. I reached inside, my hands blindly searching through the organized stacks of manila folders and leather binders. I found the folder labeled with Eleanor's medical information right away. But my fingers kept searching the cold metal bottom of the safe, looking for the familiar texture of the heavy velvet bag and the thick sealed envelope that always sat right next to our documents. They were gone. I pulled out every single folder, tossing them frantically onto the floor. I checked the back corners of the small steel box. I ran my hands over the cold metal walls, hoping against hope that I had just misplaced them. But it was completely empty. The velvet bag contained Eleanor's heirloom jewelry. It was not just expensive metal and stones. It held the diamond wedding band her grandmother brought over from Europe when her family fled the war. It held the sapphire earrings I bought her for our 20th anniversary when we finally had enough money to celebrate properly. It held the delicate gold locket she wore on the very day Trevor was born, the locket holding a tiny picture of his baby face. Those pieces were a physical map of our family history, priceless artifacts of a life built on love and endurance. The thick sealed envelope held my emergency reserve of bearer bonds. They were untraceable, high-value financial instruments that I had quietly acquired over the years as a final safety net for our retirement. I never trusted the volatile stock market with all our savings, so I kept those bonds as a guarantee that no matter what happened, Eleanor would always be taken care of. Together, the jewelry and the bonds were worth well over $200,000. Gone. All of it completely gone. I sat back on my heels, staring at the empty steel box. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My mind began to race, piecing together the timeline of the nightmare that had unfolded in my house just hours ago. Trevor and Vanessa did not force their way into this safe days or weeks ago. I had opened this very safe on Tuesday morning, before my trip to Cleveland to retrieve my passport. Everything had been untouched. The lock had been pristine. They broke into it tonight, while my wife was bleeding at the bottom of the stairs. The realization was like a physical blow to my chest. It knocked the wind right out of my lungs. I remembered the security camera footage. I remembered Vanessa walking out of the kitchen, looking down at Eleanor and telling her not to be dramatic. I remembered Vanessa going back into the kitchen and turning the music up so loud that the heavy bass vibrated through the floorboards. I had thought she turned up the music just to drown out my wife crying for help. But I was wrong. The loud music was not just a wall of sound to block out Eleanor. It was a calculated cover. They needed the noise to mask the sound of a hammer smashing into a steel keypad. They needed the loud bass to hide the sound of heavy tools prying open a metal safe right down the hall. The sheer calculated evil of their actions made my stomach violently turn. I felt a wave of nausea rush over me, followed by a burning, suffocating heat. My son did not just neglect his mother. He did not just ignore a tragic accident because he was careless or selfish. He saw an opportunity. He saw his mother broken and bleeding, incapacitated on the floor, and he realized he finally had the time and the privacy to rob me blind. Trevor knew I was out of town. He knew Eleanor was the only one home. And now Eleanor could not stop him while she was literally fighting for her life, gasping for breath and crying out his name for help. My son was in my office, stealing the jewelry she planned to pass down to her future grandchildren. He was stealing the very money I had saved to ensure she would never go hungry. I looked at the shattered pieces of the keypad resting on my floor. I pictured Trevor, swinging a hammer, sweating, rushing to get the safe open so he could get back to his fancy wine and his expensive cheese. I pictured Vanessa and her parents laughing in the kitchen, perfectly aware of the heist happening in the other room. Gerald and Marlene were not just innocent guests. They were accomplices. They sat there drinking my $200 wine, providing a distraction and celebrating their sudden windfall, while the woman who had welcomed them into her home lay dying just a few feet away. They had turned my sanctuary into a den of thieves. They had looked at my wife suffering and decided it was the perfect distraction for a robbery. I slowly gathered the medical documents from the floor, my movements rigid and precise. I did not bother closing the safe. I left the damaged door wide open as a silent promise to myself. I wanted to remember exactly what this betrayal looked like. I wanted to burn the image of that smashed keypad into my memory, so that whenever I felt a moment of pity for my son, I would remember the truth. They thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they could blame Eleanor's fall on old age and clumsy feet. They thought I would be too blinded by grief and worry to check my office. They thought they had secured a massive payday that would solve all their financial problems, allowing them to continue their lazy, parasitic lifestyle without ever having to work a real day in their lives. I stood up and turned off the brass desk lamp. The room plunged back into darkness. My hands were no longer shaking. The tears had completely dried up, replaced by an icy, focused resolve. Every ounce of grief I felt had been burned away by a cold, razor-sharp fury. I walked out of the office and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I was going to take these medical papers to the hospital to save my wife. I was going to hold her hand and tell her everything would be perfectly fine. And then I was going to call my lawyer. My son wanted to act like a ruthless criminal, exploiting the very woman who gave him life. Now he was going to find out exactly what kind of man his father truly was. I was going to tear his life apart, piece by piece, and I was going to make sure he never saw it coming. I left the hospital just as the sun was beginning to rise over the city. Eleanor was resting comfortably in the intensive care unit. The surgeons had worked for 6 grueling hours to piece her shattered hip back together and relieve the dangerous pressure inside her skull. The lead doctor told me that her survival was nothing short of a miracle. I kissed her bandaged forehead, promised her I would be right back, and walked out into the crisp morning air. I did not go back to my house. I could not stomach the thought of breathing the same air as the parasites who were currently infesting my home. I knew that if I walked through my front door and saw my son, I would not be able to control the rage boiling inside my chest. Instead, I drove straight to the downtown business district, gripping the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I parked outside a towering glass building and took the private elevator up to the 30th floor. I was there to see Curtis Vance. Curtis was not just my attorney. He was a ruthless legal predator, dressed in a tailored Italian suit. We had met 30 years ago, when I was just starting out as a logistics director for a major supply chain firm. Over the decades, Curtis had drafted every major contract, secured every real estate asset, and helped me build the formidable financial fortress that protected my family. He knew Trevor intimately. He had watched my son grow up from a spoiled teenager into an entitled adult. He knew about all the times I had quietly bailed Trevor out of bad business deals, massive credit card debts, and reckless financial decisions. Curtis always warned me that I was too soft on the boy. He always told me that shielding Trevor from the consequences of his actions would eventually backfire. I walked into his corner office before his receptionist even had time to turn on the lights or pour her first cup of coffee. Curtis looked up from his massive mahogany desk, clearly surprised to see me standing there in the wrinkled, blood-stained clothes I had worn all night. He immediately saw the dark circles under my eyes and the grim, hardened set of my jaw. He stood up abruptly, asking what was wrong and why I was not at the hospital with Eleanor. I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful explanations. I pulled the heavy silver laptop out of my briefcase and set it firmly on his immaculate desk. I told him to sit down, keep quiet, and watch the screen. I opened the video file from the hidden hallway security camera and stepped back. I watched Curtis closely as the high-definition footage began to play. For the first 20 years of our friendship, I had only ever seen Curtis keep a perfectly neutral, professional expression, regardless of the crisis at hand. But as he watched Eleanor stumble and tumble down those heavy wooden stairs, his breath hitched audibly. When the video showed Vanessa stepping out of the kitchen, holding a half-empty wine glass, looking down at my bleeding wife, and coldly telling her not to be dramatic, all the color completely drained from Curtis's face. When she walked casually back into the kitchen and the audio feed spiked with the sound of heavy bass music, designed to drown out my wife crying for help, Curtis covered his mouth with his hand. He looked physically sick. I did not stop there. I calmly explained what I had found in my home office after retrieving the medical directives. I told him about the shattered electronic keypad on the floor safe. I described the deep scratches in the wood and the broken emergency lock. I told him about the missing velvet bag containing Eleanor's grandmother's priceless wedding band and the heavy sealed envelope full of untraceable bearer bonds. I painted a perfectly clear picture of the opportunistic robbery that took place while they let my wife bleed out on the foyer rug. Curtis pushed his leather chair back so violently that the heavy legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He reached straight for the sleek black telephone on his desk. He told me he was calling the district attorney and the police chief immediately. He started listing off the criminal charges in a rapid, furious tone. Felony elder endangerment, grand larceny, depraved indifference to human life, obstruction of justice. He promised me that the police would have Trevor, Vanessa, and her miserable parents in handcuffs before the lunch hour. I reached across the desk and clamped my hand down hard over the telephone receiver, cutting off the dial tone. I looked my oldest friend dead in the eye and shook my head slowly. "No," I said softly. My voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a dark, heavy weight that made Curtis freeze in his tracks. If we arrest them right now, they get a simple slap on the wrist for negligence. They will hire a sleazy defense lawyer who will argue they were just drunk, careless, and did not realize the severity of the fall. They will claim that breaking into the floor safe was a separate, impulsive mistake, driven by alcohol and panic. They will cry in front of a sympathetic judge, play the victims of a tragic family misunderstanding, and be out on bail by dinner time. I do not want them out on bail, Curtis. I do not want a slap on the wrist. I want to know exactly what else they have stolen. I want to know the absolute depth of this betrayal before we spring the trap. Curtis slowly took his hand off the phone receiver. He leaned back in his chair, understanding exactly the kind of war I was asking him to wage. He knew the seasoned logistics director sitting across from him was building a comprehensive, inescapable strategy. "You want a full forensic audit?" Curtis stated, his eyes narrowing as his legal mind began to race. I nodded. I told him I wanted every single bank record pulled from the last 5 years. I wanted every property deed examined with a magnifying glass. I wanted him to scrutinize every trust document, every retirement account, and every fake shell company Trevor had ever tried to pitch to me for seed money. I wanted to know exactly where my son, his wife, and her parents were hiding their dirty money. I wanted to trace every single penny they had ever touched. Curtis nodded slowly, a dark, predatory gleam returning to his eyes. He told me he would assemble a team of forensic accountants immediately. He promised it would take less than 24 hours to pull the complete financial web and expose their entire operation. But he warned me about the hardest part of the plan. He told me that if we were going to build an airtight, inescapable federal case, I could not let them know I was on to them. I had to go back to the hospital. I had to look my son in the eyes and play the part of the grieving, naive, completely clueless old man. I had to let them believe they had pulled off the perfect crime. I had to make them feel so comfortable and so victorious in their deceit that they would continue making arrogant mistakes. I left Curtis's office, feeling a dangerous, electric sense of purpose. I drove back to the hospital, parking my car in the massive concrete structure. Before I walked into the main building, I sat in the driver's seat and practiced my performance. I let my shoulders slump forward. I made my breathing shallow, shaky, and uneven. I walked into the intensive care waiting room, looking exactly like a shattered old man who had completely given up on life. Trevor and Vanessa were sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chairs near the vending machines. Trevor was scrolling through his smartphone, looking completely bored and detached. Vanessa was examining her fingernails. The moment they saw me enter the room, their posture completely transformed. Trevor shoved his phone into his pocket and leaped to his feet. He rushed over and wrapped his arms around me in another sickening, theatrical embrace. He asked me where I had been all morning. He told me he was so incredibly worried about me, and that he had been praying for Mom all night. I patted his back gently, forcing myself not to shove him away or wrap my hands around his throat. I told him in a weak, trembling voice that I had gone home to get Eleanor her favorite nightgown, but I could not bring myself to stay inside the house. I told him the house felt too empty and cold. I told him I was just a tired, broken old man who did not know how to function without his beloved wife by his side. Trevor squeezed my shoulder tightly, his eyes shining with fake sympathy. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He told me he and Vanessa would take care of the estate. He said they would handle all the bills, the maintenance, and the daily responsibilities, so I could focus entirely on Mom and her recovery. The sheer audacity of his lies made my stomach violently turn, but I just nodded and thanked him, playing right into his greedy, grasping hands. Vanessa walked over and placed a comforting hand on my arm, telling me that family always sticks together in times of crisis. I thanked her too, memorizing the fake concern on her face, so I could replay it in my mind when the time came to ruin her. I stayed by Eleanor's bed for the rest of the long day. The rhythmic, steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me grounded in reality. I held her fragile, sleeping hand, brushing my thumb over her bruised skin, promising her silently that I was building a steel cage our enemies would never escape. When visiting hours finally ended late that night, I did not go back to my suburban estate. I checked myself into an upscale hotel a few blocks away from the hospital. I told Trevor I needed to be as close to the medical clinic as possible in case of an emergency. In reality, I needed a secure, private base of operations where I could coordinate with Curtis without my son snooping around my things or listening at the door. I sat in the quiet, dimly lit hotel room, staring out the large glass window at the glowing city skyline. The silence in the room was heavy and absolute. I did not turn on the television. I did not order food. I simply sat in the darkness and waited for the phone to ring. Just past midnight, my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. The caller identification glowed brightly, showing Curtis's name. I picked it up immediately, pressing the phone tightly to my ear. "Grant," Curtis said. His voice was completely devoid of its usual confident, booming swagger. He sounded genuinely rattled. He sounded like a man who had just looked deep into a terrifying abyss. "Did you find the money?" I asked. My voice was steady, calm, and perfectly cold. "Grant," Curtis breathed out heavily, the sound crackling through the receiver. "It is so much worse than the jewelry and the bearer bonds. They did not just break into your floor safe to steal some quick cash. That was just a bonus for them while they were waiting for the paramedics to arrive." I felt a tight, painful knot form deep in my chest. "What did they do, Curtis? What exactly did you find in those accounts?" Curtis paused for a long second, gathering his words carefully, as if he were delivering a death sentence. "Trevor forged your signature on a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney 3 weeks ago. He had it illegally notarized by someone connected to Vanessa's parents. They filed it with the county clerk yesterday morning. Grant, your son currently has complete, unrestricted legal control over every single asset you and Eleanor own. He can sell your house, drain your retirement, and empty your bank accounts without ever asking for your permission." The words echoed in the quiet, dark hotel room. 3 weeks ago. This was not a crime of opportunity, born out of a tragic accident on the stairs. This was a massive, calculated long con. Trevor and Vanessa had been plotting to take over my entire estate for nearly a month. They just needed Eleanor out of the way. And when she fell down those stairs, they saw their golden opportunity to let nature finish the job for them, giving them the perfect distraction to execute their financial takeover. The trap they had built was so much larger and deadlier than I had ever imagined, but they had made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They assumed I was just going to roll over and fade away with my wife. They assumed I was an obsolete old man who would blindly trust his bloodline. They did not realize that the power of attorney they so carefully forged was about to become the very rope I would use to hang them all. The transition from the hospital to the rehabilitation center took 3 agonizing weeks. Eleanor was finally stable enough to leave the intensive care unit, but the road ahead of her was incredibly steep. She was transferred to a premier physical therapy clinic on the opposite side of the city. I told my son that the daily commute from our suburban estate was simply too exhausting for a man my age. I told him I needed to be within a 5-minute drive of my wife in case her condition suddenly worsened. I packed 2 large suitcases and moved into the luxury hotel I had been using as my secret base of operations. To Trevor and Vanessa, my departure was the ultimate victory. They believed I was just a tired, broken old man who had completely surrendered his territory. They believed the house was finally theirs. They did not waste a single second. The very morning I moved my bags into the hotel, my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank. A massive charge of $12,000 had been authorized for a luxury interior design firm using one of the joint accounts Trevor now controlled with his forged documents. My attorney, Curtis, begged me to freeze the funds immediately, but I told him to hold the line. We needed to let them gorge themselves on their own arrogance. We needed them to feel absolutely invincible. I had to play my part flawlessly. I told Curtis that I was going to drop by the house unannounced to see exactly how comfortable the parasites had become. I drove back to my own neighborhood on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I did not park my car in my own driveway. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, leaning heavily on a wooden cane I had bought specifically for this performance. The moment I stepped onto my front porch, I could hear the loud, chaotic sounds of heavy construction vibrating through the solid oak front door. There was the shrill whine of power drills, the heavy thud of hammers hitting drywall, and strangers shouting loud commands over the noise. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the foyer. The beautiful cream-colored rug where my wife had nearly bled to death was completely gone, replaced by thick, industrial plastic drop cloths. I walked slowly toward the living room, gripping my cane, and the scene before me made the blood roaring in my ears turn to absolute ice. My living room was completely unrecognizable. The custom bookshelves I had built with my own two hands had been violently ripped from the walls, leaving behind jagged holes and exposed wiring. Standing right in the middle of the chaos was Vanessa, with a clipboard in her hand. Beside her were her parents, Gerald and Marlene. Gerald was holding a tape measure, loudly directing a crew of contractors to knock down the partition wall that separated the living room from Eleanor's beautiful sunroom. Marlene was pointing at the vaulted ceiling, complaining about the antique chandelier that my wife and I had bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Europe. Marlene told the contractor to throw the old dusty thing in the dumpster out back. I did not scream. I did not yell. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing my hands to tremble as I leaned heavily on my wooden cane. I walked into the room, clearing my throat weakly. Vanessa spun around, her eyes widening in momentary panic before she quickly plastered on a fake, overly sweet smile. She rushed over to me, grabbing my arm with her perfectly manicured hands. She asked me what I was doing there, and why I had not called to let them know I was visiting. She said the dust from the construction was bad for my lungs, and tried to steer me back toward the front door. I ignored her gentle pushing. I looked around the destroyed living room, letting my voice shake with manufactured grief. I asked her what was happening to our home. I asked her why the bookshelves were gone. I played the part of a confused, deeply saddened old man, mourning the loss of his memories. Trevor came rushing down the staircase before Vanessa could formulate a convincing lie. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater I knew he bought with my stolen money. He threw his arms around me, putting on a spectacular show of fake affection. He told me that since I was staying at the hotel and the house was so incredibly large and difficult to maintain, he and Vanessa decided to take the burden off my shoulders. He claimed they were just freshening the place up to make it safer and more modern for when Eleanor eventually came home. He said he wanted to surprise us with a beautiful, fully renovated space. Every word tumbling out of his mouth was a calculated lie designed to pacify a senile old fool. I looked up at my son, tears welling in my eyes that were born out of pure white-hot rage rather than sadness. I told him the house looked so different. I told him I just came back to gather some of Eleanor's comfortable sweaters because the air conditioning at the rehabilitation clinic was making her shiver at night. Trevor smiled, a greasy, victorious smirk spreading across his face. He patted my shoulder and told me to go right upstairs to the master bedroom to get whatever I needed. I gripped the wooden handrail and slowly climbed the stairs, making sure to drag my feet and breathe heavily. The second floor was just as chaotic as the first. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to my master bedroom, the breath was knocked right out of my lungs. This room had been my sanctuary for 40 years. It was where Eleanor and I had spent our quietest, most intimate moments. Now, it looked like a cheap hotel room that had been ransacked by thieves. Our heavy oak bed frame had been shoved against the far wall to make room for a massive stack of cardboard moving boxes. And sitting right on top of our mattress were 3 expensive leather suitcases with luggage tags bearing Gerald and Marlene's names. Marlene was standing inside Eleanor's walk-in closet. She was carelessly pulling my wife's expensive silk blouses and tailored dresses off their velvet hangers and tossing them into thick black garbage bags. She was throwing away decades of Eleanor's life, like it was nothing but useless trash. Gerald was standing by the large bay window, smoking a cigar inside my house, flicking the ashes directly onto the hardwood floor. I stepped into the room, letting my cane tap loudly against the floorboards. Marlene jumped, dropping a handful of silk scarves into the plastic bag. Gerald quickly stubbed out his cigar on the windowsill. They stared at me with wide, guilty eyes. Neither of them said a single word. Trevor appeared behind me in the doorway, sensing the tension in the room. He quickly stepped in front of his in-laws, shielding them from my gaze. He put his hands on my shoulders and spoke to me in the slow, patronizing tone you would use to calm down a frightened child. He told me that since he and Vanessa were taking over the remodeling project downstairs, they decided it would be best if Gerald and Marlene moved into the master suite temporarily. He claimed Gerald had a bad back and needed the extra space and the larger mattress. He looked me right in the eye and said that since Eleanor and I would be at the clinic for the foreseeable future, it simply made practical sense to let the family utilize the empty space. I stared into my son's greedy, empty eyes. I remembered the years I spent working double shifts at the logistics firm, just so I could afford to buy this house. I remembered coming home exhausted, my hands calloused and sore, only to spend my weekends painting these walls and planting the garden out back so Trevor would have a beautiful place to grow up. I had given him everything. I had shielded him from every hardship the world had to offer, and this was my reward. He was literally erasing my existence from the very walls I built, replacing my wife with the people who sat in my kitchen drinking wine while she bled on the floor. I nodded slowly, letting a single tear fall down my cheek. I looked at Trevor and told him I understood. I told him I knew how hard it was to manage such a large property, and thanked him for taking such good care of the house while his mother and I were struggling. I told him I was just a tired old man who could not handle the stress anymore. The relief on his face was immediate and absolute. He truly believed he had won. He believed I had completely surrendered my home, my wealth, and my dignity. I walked past Marlene and gathered 3 of Eleanor's softest sweaters from the few shelves they had not completely emptied yet. I folded them carefully, ignoring the heavy garbage bags filled with my wife's belongings. I did not say a word to Gerald or Marlene. I walked out of the master bedroom, slowly making my way back down the staircase. Trevor and Vanessa watched me leave from the top of the stairs, holding hands, looking like the proud new monarchs of my stolen kingdom. I walked out the front door and down the street to where I had parked my car. The moment I slid into the driver's seat and closed the heavy door, the act was over. I tossed the wooden cane onto the passenger seat. I wiped the fake tears from my face. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic, dangerous precision. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Curtis's number. When he answered, I did not bother with a greeting. I told him they had moved the in-laws into my bedroom. I told him they were destroying the living room and throwing away my wife's clothes. I told him they were spending the stolen money faster than we had even anticipated. Curtis asked me if I was ready to pull the plug and send the police to the house right now. I told him to let them finish measuring the living room. I told him to let them buy their expensive new furniture and plan their grand parties. They wanted to play house with my money. I was going to let them invite every single investor, friend, and business partner they knew to see their new stolen empire. I wanted the audience to be massive. The trap was set. The bait was taken, and the silent adjustment was rapidly approaching its explosive conclusion. I sat in the sterile silence of my hotel room, watching the city lights blink against the dark glass of the window. The heavy quiet of the room was a stark contrast to the violent storm raging inside my mind. I had just returned from watching my son and his greedy in-laws desecrate the very bedroom where my wife and I had spent the best years of our lives. My phone rested on the glass coffee table, and I stared at it without blinking. I was waiting for Curtis. I knew my attorney was assembling a team of forensic accountants to dig through the financial ruins of my life. I prepared myself for bad news, but nothing could have truly prepared me for the sheer scale of the nightmare Curtis was about to drop on my lap. A sharp knock at the door broke my concentration. I walked over and pulled it open to find Curtis standing in the hallway. He looked terrible. His usually immaculate tailored suit looked rumpled, and his tie was pulled loose around his neck. Curtis was a man who had spent 30 years destroying corporate rivals in the courtroom without ever breaking a sweat. But right now, he looked like a man who had just witnessed a murder. He carried a massive leather briefcase that seemed to weigh him down. He walked past me without saying a word and dropped the heavy bag onto the dining table. The dull thud echoed through the quiet suite. Curtis opened the briefcase and pulled out 4 thick manila folders, completely overflowing with bank statements and legal printouts. He spread them across the table. He did not look me in the eye. He just stared at the papers and took a long, deep breath. He told me to sit down because the financial bleeding was completely catastrophic. I took a seat across from him and braced myself. Curtis opened the first folder and slid a stack of highlighted banking records toward me. He told me that Trevor did not just use the forged power of attorney to pay for his fancy wine and his wife's expensive clothes. Trevor had systematically dismantled my entire retirement portfolio in a matter of 3 weeks. He drained the liquid savings accounts first, taking over $100,000 in cash that I had set aside for Eleanor's medical care and our daily living expenses. Then he went after the heavy artillery. Curtis pointed to a series of massive wire transfers. Trevor had liquidated my primary investment accounts and my individual retirement accounts. He took brutal financial penalties for early withdrawal, but he did not care, because it was not his money to lose. He siphoned nearly $500,000 out of the market and funneled it directly into a series of shady corporate accounts. I stared at the numbers on the page, feeling a sickening, hollow ache in the pit of my stomach. That money represented 40 years of my life. It represented every double shift I worked at the logistics firm. It represented every vacation Eleanor and I skipped so we could build a bulletproof safety net for our family. Trevor wiped it out, with a few forged signatures and a total lack of a human conscience. I asked Curtis where the money went. I knew my son was lazy and entitled, but I could not comprehend how he could burn through $500,000 in less than a month. Curtis pulled out the second folder, and the grim reality of my son's pathetic life finally came to light. Trevor was drowning in massive hidden business debts. His so-called technology startup was a complete sham. He had taken out massive loans from aggressive private lenders and shady credit organizations to fund his lavish lifestyle and his failing business model. His creditors were closing in on him. They were threatening to seize his assets and destroy his life. Trevor was bleeding me dry simply to save his own skin. He used his father's life savings to pay off the people he was too stupid to avoid. The betrayal was so profound, it physically hurt to breathe. But Curtis was not finished. He told me the stolen cash was only the beginning of their operation. The real prize, the crown jewel of their entire criminal conspiracy, was my house. Curtis opened the third folder and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents bearing the official seal of the county clerk. He slid them across the glass table. I looked down and saw a quiet title transfer. My heart stopped beating in my chest. Curtis explained the grim reality of what I was looking at. Vanessa's parents were not just obnoxious freeloaders who wanted to sleep in a comfortable bed. Gerald and Marlene were the masterminds behind the entire real estate theft. Gerald knew that simply selling the house would raise too many red flags and trigger title insurance investigations that might expose the forged power of attorney. So Gerald convinced Trevor to use a legal loophole. They created a phantom real estate trust and named Gerald as the primary trustee. Then, using the forged power of attorney, Trevor legally gifted the deed of my $1.2 million estate directly into the trust. They effectively stole the physical house right out from under me. They transferred the ownership of the home I built with my own 2 hands to a man who sat in my kitchen eating cheese while my wife bled on the floor. I was officially a trespasser on my own property. I asked Curtis why Gerald would orchestrate such a complicated legal maneuver instead of just taking the cash. Curtis shook his head and explained the ultimate greedy endgame of their plan. Trevor needed collateral. He was desperately trying to secure a new round of massive investor funding to revive his dead business and keep his wealthy facade intact. But no legitimate venture capitalist would ever give him a dime without substantial assets to back up the loan. Trevor and Gerald conspired to use my stolen estate as the financial collateral to impress incredibly wealthy private investors. They were going to leverage my home to borrow millions of dollars, leaving me homeless and completely destitute if their risky business ventures failed. The sheer audacity of their plan left me completely speechless. They had calculated every single move. They had assessed my worth, stripped me of my life savings, and stolen the roof over my head while smiling in my face and offering me fake hugs in the hospital waiting room. They thought I was nothing but a stepping stone, a disposable resource they could exhaust and discard without a second thought. Curtis slammed his fist down on the table, causing the paperwork to jump. He was practically vibrating with righteous anger. He told me we had enough evidence to bury them all under a federal prison. He wanted to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. He wanted to march into that house with a team of armed detectives and drag Gerald out of my master bedroom in handcuffs. He promised me he could get the assets frozen and the title transfer reversed by a judge before the end of the week. I sat back in my chair and looked at the glowing city lights out the window. The rage inside me had crystallized into something incredibly cold and completely unbreakable. Arresting them quietly and letting the lawyers sort it out behind closed doors was not enough. They did not just break the law. They humiliated my wife. They stripped away my dignity and paraded around my home like conquering kings. I wanted to destroy them so publicly and so profoundly that they would never be able to show their faces in civilized society again. Before I could speak, my cell phone chimed brightly on the coffee table. I picked it up and saw an email notification forwarded to me by an old family friend who thought I should be aware of what my son was doing. I opened the message and read the contents. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. It was an exclusive digital invitation. The graphics were glossy, arrogant, and perfectly designed. The bold, golden letters across the top of the screen read, "You are cordially invited to the Whitaker Estate housewarming and business launch." I read the details of the invitation out loud to Curtis. Trevor was hosting a massive, extravagant gala at my stolen house this coming Saturday night. The invitation boasted about fully catered dining, a live string quartet, and an exclusive presentation of his new business ventures. He was inviting the very venture capitalists and wealthy investors he planned to defraud, using my stolen property as collateral. He was throwing a party to celebrate the successful theft of my life. He was going to stand in my living room, drink my wine, and present himself as a brilliant, successful entrepreneur to the elite members of our city. Curtis stared at me, waiting to see how I would react to this ultimate, insulting blow. He asked me if I wanted him to serve them with a restraining order and shut the party down before it even began. I looked at the digital invitation glowing on my phone screen. I pictured Trevor in a tailored suit shaking hands with millionaires. I pictured Vanessa showing off the renovations they made by throwing away my wife's clothing. I pictured Gerald and Marlene standing in the corner, acting like wealthy aristocrats. The trap they had built for themselves was so incredibly perfect that I did not even have to lift a finger to set it up. They were gathering all their victims, all their wealthy targets, and all their arrogant pride into one single room. I placed the phone gently back onto the glass table. I looked at Curtis and smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of an apex predator, watching its prey wander blindly into an inescapable cage. I told Curtis we were not going to freeze a single account. I told him we were not going to call the police to stop the party. We were going to let the caterers arrive. We were going to let the champagne flow and the music play. We were going to let Trevor stand in front of the wealthiest people in the city and claim his stolen kingdom. We were going to let him reach the absolute highest peak of his arrogant pride. And then I was going to walk through the front door and burn his entire world to the ground in front of a live audience. I told Curtis to prepare the fraud injunctions, to perfectly time the collapse of their credit lines, and to coordinate privately with the local detectives. I was going to give my son exactly what he wanted. I was going to give him the biggest, most unforgettable party of his entire pathetic life. My entire professional career was built on the foundation of precise logistics. I spent 4 decades managing complex supply chains, ensuring that thousands of moving parts arrived at their exact destination at the perfect moment. I knew how to identify weaknesses in a system, and I knew how to execute a flawless operation. I applied that exact same methodology to the destruction of my son. Curtis and I spent the next 48 hours locked inside his downtown office building, creating an invisible digital fortress around my stolen estate. I told him I did not want Trevor to feel a single drop of panic until the exact moment the trap snapped shut. If my son noticed that his credit cards were declining days before his massive party, he might try to flee the state or destroy valuable evidence. We needed him to feel absolutely invincible, right up until the second his world collapsed completely. Curtis utilized a very specific and highly classified federal fraud injunction. It was a legal maneuver typically reserved for massive corporate embezzlement cases. By submitting our undeniable proof of the forged power of attorney to a federal judge in a closed-door emergency session, we secured a quiet freeze on every single compromised account. But Curtis went one step further to ensure the performance would be absolutely flawless. He coordinated directly with the regional bank executives to implement what he called a ghost hold. The banking system would artificially reflect the stolen balances on the front end of the user interface. Trevor could check his mobile banking application and see millions of dollars sitting safely in his accounts. He believed he had outsmarted the entire financial system. He believed his forged documents were absolutely bulletproof. He could swipe his platinum credit cards to buy his expensive champagne and rent his luxury catering equipment for the upcoming gala. The banks would quietly approve the pending authorizations to maintain the beautiful illusion. But those funds were completely paralyzed. Curtis programmed the central banking servers to trigger a hard, catastrophic decline across every single financial institution at exactly 8 o'clock on Saturday night. Trevor was currently building a massive house of cards on a foundation of pure vapor. He was racking up thousands of dollars in new debt to throw a party to celebrate his theft, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already turned to dust. I knew that cornering a desperate man could be incredibly dangerous. When the money vanished and the truth came out, Trevor and his greedy in-laws would inevitably panic. Gerald was a pathetic coward who would immediately look for the nearest exit the moment he realized the authorities were involved. I could not allow a single one of them to slip away into the night before the police arrived. I needed absolute control over the physical environment. Using my legitimate emergency funds, I hired a premier private security firm staffed entirely by highly trained former military personnel. These were men who had handled hostile extractions and secure transport operations overseas. Dealing with a spoiled thief and his cowardly in-laws would be a simple task for them. I met with their operations director in the quiet lobby of my hotel. I handed him the digital invitation my son had created. I explained that I was the rightful owner of the property and that the people hosting the event were actively under a severe criminal investigation. I hired 12 men to dress in plain black suits and blend in seamlessly with the catering staff and the valet drivers. Their orders were very simple and incredibly strict. They were to secure the perimeter of my estate starting at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. They were to discreetly lock the electronic gates, block the long driveway with their vehicles, and stand quietly by every exterior door. No one would be allowed to leave the property once the clock struck 8. They were the silent and immovable walls of the cage I was building for my family. With the financial trap set and the physical perimeter secured, Curtis and I drove to the local police precinct. We did not speak to a patrol officer at the front desk. Curtis bypassed the public lobby and took us directly to the Violent Crimes Division to meet with a seasoned lead detective he had known for years. We sat in a small, windowless interrogation room. The detective folded his hands on the metal table and asked us why 2 wealthy older men were sitting in his precinct on a Thursday afternoon. I did not say a single word. I simply opened my silver laptop, turned the screen toward him, and pressed play on the security footage. I forced myself to stare at the blank cinder block wall while the video played. I could not bring myself to watch my wife fall down those heavy wooden stairs again. I just listened to the heavy silence in the room. I watched the detective's face shift from professional curiosity to absolute visceral disgust. He watched Vanessa walk out of the kitchen, look down at my bleeding wife, and coldly tell her to stop being dramatic. He listened to the heavy bass music vibrate through the computer speakers as she walked away, leaving Eleanor to suffer. When the video ended, the detective closed the laptop himself. His jaw was clenched tight. He did not ask any questions about the fall. He looked at Curtis and asked what else they had done. Curtis handed over the thick forensic file, highlighting the forged signatures, the stolen retirement funds, and the fraudulent real estate trust. The detective pulled out a thick yellow notepad. He ran his fingers over the copied signatures, noting how amateurish the forgery actually looked when placed next to my genuine signature. He told us that leaving an elderly woman to bleed on the floor, while actively preventing her from receiving life-saving medical care, easily constituted felony elder neglect and reckless endangerment. He said the massive financial theft elevated the entire situation to a federal wire fraud and criminal conspiracy case. He began drafting the criminal warrants right there at the metal table. I told the detective about the lavish party Trevor was throwing on Saturday night. I offered him the perfect opportunity to round up all 4 conspirators in one single room without any chance of a dangerous pursuit or a messy public standoff. The detective agreed to the strategy immediately. He promised to have a fleet of unmarked vehicles waiting in silence at the end of my street, ready to move in the moment I gave the signal. When every single preparation was finalized, I drove across the city to the rehabilitation clinic to visit Eleanor. The room was quiet and comfortably warm. She was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. I sat in the padded chair next to her bed and gently held her fragile hand. Her skin felt much warmer than it had in days. The doctors told me her recovery was progressing beautifully and that she would be able to come back to a safe home very soon. I looked at her resting face and felt a profound sense of clarity wash over my tired mind. For 40 years, my only purpose was to provide a safe and comfortable life for my family. I had worked tirelessly to build a lasting legacy of love and ultimate security. My son had taken that unconditional love and weaponized it against us. He had treated my boundless generosity as a fatal weakness. He had mistaken my quiet patience for foolishness. I gently kissed the back of my wife's hand and whispered a silent promise to her sleeping form. The pain and the terrible fear she endured on that cold foyer floor would not go unanswered. The arrogant people who stepped over her broken body were going to lose their freedom, their reputation, and their stolen wealth in front of the entire city. I stood up and walked out of the clinic, feeling significantly lighter than I had in weeks. The complex preparations were completely finished. The legal documents were securely signed, the federal judges had officially ruled, and the criminal arrest warrants were printed and waiting. Every single piece of the logistical puzzle was locked into its proper place. All that was left to do was put on my best tailored suit and attend a housewarming party. Saturday evening arrived with a cool and crisp autumn breeze that swept through the city streets. I stood in front of the full-length mirror inside my quiet hotel suite and looked at the man staring back at me. I did not wear the baggy gray sweaters or the scuffed brown loafers of the defeated and broken old man they thought I was. I opened a heavy garment bag and pulled out a dark navy bespoke suit I had tailored in Milan many years ago during my corporate logistics days. The fabric felt like a familiar suit of armor. I buttoned a crisp white dress shirt and knotted a deep crimson silk tie at my throat. I walked into the marble bathroom and shaved the rough gray stubble from my jaw until my face was perfectly smooth and sharp. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection one last time. The grieving and confused father was completely gone. The man standing in the mirror was a predator, ready to reclaim his territory. I walked out of the hotel and stepped into the cool night air, feeling more powerful than I had in decades. I drove my car towards my old neighborhood, taking the familiar winding streets that I had driven thousands of times before. I did not park in my own driveway. I parked my vehicle 2 blocks away, hidden in the dark shadows of a large oak tree. As I walked down the sidewalk, I could see the massive glow of temporary floodlights, illuminating the front facade of my sprawling estate. The long circular driveway was completely packed with sleek European sports cars and heavy luxury utility vehicles. Valet drivers in crisp white shirts and black bow ties were jogging back and forth, taking keys from the wealthy elite of our city. But I knew the absolute truth about those valet drivers. I recognized the broad shoulders, the disciplined posture, and the alert eyes of the private security contractors I had hired. As I walked past the valet podium, the team leader gave me a single subtle nod. The perimeter was perfectly locked down. The electronic gates were disabled and blocked by heavy vehicles. No one was leaving this property until I gave the command. I walked up the paved driveway with slow and deliberate steps. The heavy oak front doors of my home were thrown wide open to welcome the city elite. A beautiful, elegant melody from a live string quartet drifted through the cool evening air, blending with the loud hum of dozens of overlapping conversations. I stepped over the threshold and into the grand foyer. The exact space where my wife had bled on the floor just weeks ago was now covered by a plush, temporary red carpet. Waiters in black vests floated effortlessly through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and tiny porcelain spoons holding expensive caviar. The sheer volume of the arrogance and the extravagant waste was absolutely staggering. They were burning through my stolen life savings at a sickening pace, simply to impress a room full of strangers. I walked into the main living room and stood quietly near the back wall, blending perfectly into the dark shadows of a large potted palm tree. I wanted to observe the parasites in their natural habitat before I struck my first blow. The room was packed to the brim with powerful venture capitalists, local politicians, and wealthy socialites dressed in designer gowns and flashing expensive watches. And right in the center of the room, holding court like European royalty, were Vanessa's parents. Gerald was wearing a rented tuxedo that clearly did not fit his thick frame. He was holding a heavy glass of expensive scotch and laughing loudly at a joke told by a prominent investment banker. I watched Gerald slap the banker on the back and boast loudly about his brilliant real estate portfolio. Marlene was standing right beside him, draped in a sparkling silver gown and showing off a heavy diamond necklace that caught the light of the crystal chandelier. It took every single ounce of my willpower not to march across the room and rip that necklace right off her throat, because I knew exactly whose money paid for those diamonds. They were acting like old money aristocrats, completely intoxicated by the illusion of their stolen wealth. Vanessa was gliding gracefully through the massive crowd, wearing a stunning emerald green dress that cost more than most working families make in a month. She was smiling brightly, kissing cheeks, and playing the role of the perfect wealthy hostess. She looked completely unbothered by the fact that she had literally stepped over a dying woman to achieve this lavish lifestyle. She was drinking champagne and accepting compliments on the beautiful renovations she had made to my home. Then I saw my son. Trevor was standing near the massive marble fireplace, surrounded by a tight circle of older, wealthy men. He was holding a tall glass of champagne and gesturing confidently with his hands as he pitched his fraudulent business ideas to the crowd. I stood in the shadows and listened to him speak. He was telling the investors about the value of hard work and the dedication it took to build a successful empire from the ground up. The absolute hypocrisy of his words made my stomach turn. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my entire legacy and transformed it into his own brilliant success story. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, holding the entire world in the palm of his hand. I decided I had seen enough of their pathetic masquerade. I did not hide in the dark shadows for another second. I stepped out into the bright light of the living room and began walking directly toward the center of the house. I did not use the wooden cane I had faked needing for the past 3 weeks. I did not limp or drag my feet. I walked with the heavy, authoritative, and uncompromising stride of a man who owned every single brick in the building. The crowd was dense, but my presence seemed to radiate a cold and dangerous energy. A few of the wealthy guests noticed me immediately and stepped aside instinctively, parting like the sea to let me through. They sensed the intense predatory focus in my completely silent approach. Vanessa was the very first one of the family to see me. She was laughing loudly at something a wealthy guest had just said, but her bright smile froze completely when her eyes locked onto mine across the room. The color drained from her face in an instant. The crystal champagne flute slipped right through her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp, loud sound of breaking glass echoed through the massive room, causing the string quartet in the corner to falter and stop playing their instruments. The loud, buzzing chatter of the party slowly died down as more and more guests turned their heads to see what had frightened the beautiful hostess. Trevor heard the glass shatter and turned away from his captive audience of wealthy investors. He looked across the suddenly silent room and saw me standing there, right in the middle of his stolen kingdom. All the blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, pale ghost. He stared at my dark, tailored suit, my perfect posture, and the cold, unblinking stare of the father he thought he had completely destroyed. Gerald and Marlene noticed the sudden, heavy silence and turned their heads toward the center of the room. Marlene let out a small, breathless gasp and took a clumsy step backward, bumping hard into a tall cocktail table and spilling drinks onto the floor. Gerald lowered his glass of scotch, his mouth opening and closing, without a single sound coming out. They were all staring at me in absolute frozen horror. The music was gone. The laughter was completely dead. In that singular, terrifying moment, the entire family realized that the fragile, broken old man they thought they had so easily defeated was nothing but a calculated and deadly illusion. The real Grant Whitaker had finally arrived to his own party, and the absolute destruction of their lives was about to begin. The silence in my living room was so absolute that I could hear the panicked, shallow breathing of my son, standing just a few feet away. Trevor was paralyzed, staring at me, as if a ghost had just walked out of the walls to drag him down to hell. But before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse for why he was throwing a lavish gala in my stolen home, the precise digital trap that my attorney Curtis and I had spent days building finally snapped shut. A man wearing a sharp black suit and a frantic expression pushed his way through the frozen crowd of wealthy investors. It was the lead catering manager. He was clutching a silver tablet tightly to his chest, and he was sweating profusely. He was completely oblivious to the massive family standoff happening right in front of him. His only concern was the massive financial error flashing in bright red letters across his screen. He stepped directly between Trevor and me, breaking the heavy tension in the room. He leaned in close to my son and apologized profusely for the interruption. He told Trevor that there was a severe problem with the billing system. He explained that the final $15,000 payment for the caviar, the imported champagne, and the serving staff had just been catastrophically declined by the bank. The timing was so incredibly perfect, it felt like a symphony. Trevor blinked rapidly, struggling to process this new immediate disaster, while still reeling from the shock of seeing me alive and standing in my own house. The color rushed back into his pale face, turning his cheeks a bright, embarrassed crimson. He let out a loud, nervous laugh that sounded more like a choke. He told the catering manager that it was obviously just a simple banking error. He said the fraud department probably flagged the massive charge because it was a weekend evening. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket with trembling hands and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. He handed it to the manager with a forced, arrogant smile, completely desperate to maintain his wealthy facade in front of the surrounding venture capitalists. The manager quickly inserted the heavy metal card into a mobile terminal. The machine processed for 3 long, agonizing seconds before letting out a sharp, loud, rejecting beep that echoed clearly over the silent crowd. The terminal flashed a bright red declined notification. The forced smile on Trevor's face completely shattered. A bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. The wealthy investors standing in a tight circle around the fireplace began to shift uncomfortably. These were men who managed hundreds of millions of dollars for a living. They knew the sound of a declined credit card, and they knew that a man who could not pay his caterer was not a man you ever trusted with your investment capital. They began to exchange highly skeptical sideways glances. The brilliant entrepreneurial illusion my son had spent weeks building was beginning to crack right in front of their eyes. Trevor aggressively snatched the platinum card back from the manager and pulled out his thick leather wallet. He told the man to use his premium black card instead, claiming he probably just hit his daily spending limit on the first account. The manager swiped the black card. Another sharp, loud beep ripped through the quiet room. Declined. Trevor's hands began to shake violently. He pulled out a gold corporate card, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He shoved it into the terminal himself. Declined. Every single financial lifeline he tried to grab turned into pure dust in his hands. The murmurs in the living room began to grow louder. The polite silence of the high society guests transformed into a low buzzing wave of blatant gossip and growing disgust. Vanessa realized exactly what was happening. She saw the wealthy wives of the investors whispering behind their manicured hands and looking at her with absolute pity. Her desperate need to be seen as a wealthy elite socialite completely short-circuited her brain. Instead of remaining calm, she marched right up to the catering manager and threw a massive, humiliating public tantrum. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at the poor manager's face and screamed that his equipment was completely broken. She yelled that they were incredibly wealthy people and that this technical malfunction was a massive insult to their reputation. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. She demanded that he stop embarrassing them in front of their important guests and threatened to utterly destroy his catering business online if he did not fix the machine immediately. The investors watched her aggressive meltdown with total revulsion. Wealthy people do not scream at the help over a declined card. The sheer lack of class Vanessa displayed was the final nail in the coffin for their elaborate masquerade. Gerald rushed forward, trying to play the part of the wealthy aristocratic father to save his daughter from total social ruin. He puffed out his chest and told the caterer not to worry about a single thing. He pulled out his own premium credit card and told the man to put the entire party on his personal tab. What Gerald did not realize was that Curtis had meticulously linked every single account associated with the forged trust. Gerald swiped his card, and the terminal let out that same agonizing, rejecting beep. Gerald's jaw dropped open. He pulled out a second card, and it declined instantly. The entire fraudulent empire they had built was collapsing openly and spectacularly in the middle of my living room. Trevor pulled his smartphone out of his pocket, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He opened his premium banking application, desperately trying to figure out why his endless supply of stolen money had vanished. I stood silently in the shadows and watched his eyes widen in absolute pure terror. The application that had shown a balance of over $2 million just an hour ago now displayed nothing but catastrophic red error messages. The screen read that his accounts were entirely frozen, pending a massive federal fraud investigation, and instructed him to contact his branch administrator immediately. Trevor slowly lowered his phone. He looked past the panicked caterer, past his screaming wife, and past his humiliated father-in-law. He looked directly at me. I was standing there with my hands clasped calmly behind my back, wearing a sharp navy suit and a cold, unblinking stare. He finally connected the dots. He realized I did not just survive the hospital. I survived to financially annihilate him. He realized I had known about his theft, his forgeries, and his betrayal for weeks. He realized he was not the smartest predator in the room. He was just a foolish mouse that had wandered blindly into the most elaborate trap ever built. I decided they had suffered enough private humiliation with the catering staff. It was time for the main event. I wanted every single person in this house to know exactly who these parasites truly were. I turned and walked slowly toward a massive crystal champagne tower that had been set up near the grand staircase. I picked up a delicate silver stirring spoon from a tray of garnishes and gently lifted a tall crystal flute filled with imported champagne. I walked back to the exact center of the living room, stopping on the very spot where my wife had bled on the floor just a few weeks prior. I raised my arm high in the air and tapped the silver spoon firmly against the crystal glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through Vanessa's hysterical screaming and the loud buzzing whispers of the wealthy investors. It was a commanding, authoritative sound that demanded absolute attention. One by one, the guests stopped talking. The catering manager stepped back. Gerald lowered his useless credit cards. Every single eye in my sprawling home turned directly toward me, waiting in heavy, breathless silence to see what the true master of the estate was about to do next. The crystal glass rang out with a pure, clear tone. The sound pierced through the heavy murmurs of the confused guests. I lowered the silver spoon and looked around my living room. The wealthy investors and socialites turned their attention to me. They were expecting an apology for the catering disaster, or perhaps an explanation for the declined credit cards. Instead, they were about to get the absolute truth. I took a deep breath and let my voice carry across the large open space. "Good evening," I said smoothly. My voice was calm and steady. "I want to thank every single one of you for taking the time to come to my home tonight. I know the invitations said this was a housewarming party to celebrate a new business venture, but there is a slight correction that needs to be made." Trevor rushed forward. His face was slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He grabbed my forearm tightly. His fingers were shaking so badly I could feel the vibrations through the fabric of my tailored suit. "Dad, stop it," he whispered frantically. His voice was a pathetic, trembling hiss. "You are embarrassing us. Please, just go upstairs, and we can talk about this later." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at his fingers until he felt the icy, radiating anger coming from my gaze. He slowly released his grip and took a step back. He looked like a frightened child who had finally realized he was standing in the cage with a predator. "As I was saying," I continued, addressing the crowd, "this is my home. I built it 40 years ago, with my wife Eleanor. And the people you have been drinking with tonight are not successful entrepreneurs. They are thieves." A loud collective gasp swept through the room. The primary investor, a tall, silver-haired man who had been listening to Trevor pitch his fraudulent company just minutes ago, narrowed his eyes. The room became so quiet that the only sound was the gentle rustling of expensive dresses and the anxious breathing of my son. "My son and his wife did not earn the money they used to throw this party," I said. "They stole it from my retirement accounts. They forged a power of attorney to illegally transfer the deed of this very house into a fake trust controlled by his father-in-law. They did all of this while my wife was fighting for her life." Vanessa let out a loud, hysterical sob. "He is lying," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He is a confused old man. He does not know what he is talking about. Someone get him out of here." I did not argue with her. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it directly at the massive smart television mounted above the marble fireplace. The screen blinked to life. I pressed a single button, and the hidden security camera footage from the night of Eleanor's fall began to play. The high-definition video illuminated the entire living room. Every guest turned their head to watch the screen. They saw the empty hallway. They saw my beautiful wife Eleanor walk into the frame holding a laundry basket, and they watched in absolute horror as her foot caught the edge of the carpet. They watched her tumble down the heavy wooden stairs, hitting the floor with a silent, sickening impact. Several women in the crowd covered their mouths. A few men turned their heads away, unable to watch the brutal reality of the fall. But I did not pause the video. I let it play. The timestamp in the corner of the screen ticked away the minutes. The wealthy crowd watched in complete frozen silence as my wife writhed in agony on the floor. And then the kitchen doors swung open on the screen. Vanessa stepped out into the hallway, holding her half-full wine glass. The guests watched as the beautiful, elegant hostess who had just been pouring them champagne looked down at her bleeding mother-in-law. I had connected the audio feed to the surround sound speakers in the living room. Vanessa's cold, flat voice echoed perfectly across the silent crowd. "Do not be dramatic." The entire room recoiled physically. The primary investor dropped his jaw in pure disgust. Vanessa watched herself on the massive screen, and her legs completely gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably and burying her face in her hands. She knew her reputation, her social standing, and her entire future were completely dead. The video showed her turning her back on Eleanor and walking away. Then the loud, heavy bass music suddenly blasted through the speakers, drowning out the sound of a dying woman crying for help. I turned off the television. The sudden silence in the living room was incredibly heavy and absolutely suffocating. I walked over to the primary investor. He was staring at Trevor with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Men of his stature did not tolerate being lied to, and they certainly did not tolerate doing business with monsters. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents. I handed them directly to the investor. "That is the forensic audit," I said clearly. "It details every single stolen dollar, every fake credit card, and the forged real estate deed they used to try and secure your funding. They were planning to use my stolen home as collateral to steal your investment capital." The investor snatched the papers from my hand. He flipped through the pages, reading the highlighted sections, showing the fraudulent transfers. He looked up at Trevor and threw the documents right at my son's chest. The heavy papers scattered across the floor like falling leaves. "You are completely finished," the investor said, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "I will make sure no one in this city ever takes a meeting with you again. You make me sick." Trevor fell to his knees, scrambling on the floor, trying to gather the scattered documents, as if picking them up could somehow fix the shattered pieces of his life. He was crying, begging the investor to listen to him, and pleading that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But no one was listening anymore. The wealthy guests began to turn their backs on him, moving quickly toward the front hallway to leave the toxic environment. They wanted nothing to do with the criminal disaster unfolding in front of them. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the back of the house. Gerald had been watching his daughter collapse and his son-in-law beg on the floor. He realized the entire fraudulent empire was collapsing, and he decided to do what cowards always do. He tried to run. He quietly slipped away from the crowd and shuffled quickly toward the heavy glass patio doors, hoping to escape through the backyard into the dark night. But Curtis and I had planned for every single possibility. As Gerald reached for the brass handle of the patio door, the heavy wooden front doors of the estate burst open with a loud, booming crash. A team of uniformed police officers and plain-clothed detectives marched into the grand foyer. They moved with swift, tactical precision, completely cutting off every single exit. The lead detective walked straight into the living room, holding up a thick stack of printed warrants. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside illuminated the large front windows, casting a chaotic spinning glow over the terrified faces of my family. The silent adjustment had reached its final devastating conclusion. The heavy oak front doors flew open, and a massive wave of blue uniforms flooded into my grand foyer. The lead detective marched directly into the center of the living room, holding a thick stack of criminal warrants high in the air. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside danced wildly across the vaulted ceilings, casting harsh, spinning shadows over the terrified faces of my family. The wealthy investors and socialite guests scrambled backward, pressing themselves tightly against the expensive walls, desperate to distance themselves from the criminals standing in the center of the room. Gerald was the very first to realize there was absolutely no escape from the trap I had built. He had almost reached the glass patio doors leading to the backyard, but two massive private security contractors in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the garden, blocking his path completely. They grabbed Gerald by the arms and shoved him roughly back into the bright light of the living room, directly into the waiting hands of a uniformed police officer. The face of my father-in-law turned a brilliant shade of purple as the cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his thick wrists. He tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, claiming he was just a guest and knew absolutely nothing about any stolen money or forged documents. But the lead detective simply ignored his cowardly lies. Marlene reacted to the sight of her husband in handcuffs by letting out a shrill, deafening scream. She completely lost whatever fake aristocratic composure she had left. She began wildly thrashing her arms, refusing to let the female officer secure her hands behind her back. She yelled at the top of her lungs that her silver designer gown cost $5,000 and that the rough uniforms of the police officers were ruining her delicate silk fabric. It was a completely absurd and sickening display of pure greed, even in the face of severe federal criminal charges. The officers did not care about her expensive dress or her massive diamond necklace. They forcefully turned her around and locked the heavy metal cuffs onto her wrists, reading her Miranda rights in a loud, steady voice that echoed clearly over her hysterical sobbing. Vanessa was still collapsed on the polished hardwood floor, right beneath the massive smart television that had just broadcasted her ultimate cruelty to the entire room. She looked absolutely pathetic. The beautiful, confident hostess, who had been sipping expensive champagne and insulting the catering manager just minutes ago, was completely gone. Her designer emerald green dress was bunched up around her knees, and her carefully styled hair was an absolute mess. Two large police officers stood over her, ordering her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. Vanessa looked up at the officers with wide, terrified eyes, shaking her head rapidly. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Trevor and screamed that he was the mastermind behind everything. She sobbed uncontrollably, telling the detectives that her husband forced her to go along with the fraudulent real estate trust, and that she never wanted to hurt anyone. She threw the man she supposedly loved right under the bus, without a single second of hesitation, hoping to save her own skin. The officers simply pulled her up by her arms, ignoring her selfish betrayals, and secured the handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Trevor stood completely frozen near the marble fireplace. He watched his entire fraudulent empire, his marriage and his freedom, collapse into absolute dust in a matter of seconds. The investors he had tried so desperately to impress were now pulling out their cell phones, capturing his ultimate public humiliation on video. The lead detective walked directly up to my son, reading off the massive list of federal and state charges: wire fraud, grand larceny, forgery of legal documents, felony elder endangerment, reckless disregard for human life. Every single charge sounded like a heavy hammer, striking a long, rusty nail right into his coffin. An officer grabbed the shoulder of my son and forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, snapping shut, seemed to finally break the heavy trance he was trapped in. He snapped his head around, looking frantically through the crowd of disgusted onlookers until his desperate eyes locked directly onto mine. I was standing perfectly still near the center of the room, my posture rigid and my face completely devoid of any emotion. I felt absolutely nothing for the man in handcuffs. The deep, paternal love I had carried in my heart for 35 years had been completely burned away, leaving only a cold, heavy block of solid ice. "Dad!" Trevor screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. He dragged his feet across the floor, fighting the police officers as they tried to pull him toward the front door. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them this is all a massive mistake. I will give everything back. I will sign the house back over to you right now. I promise I will make this right." I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at him, watching the pure animal terror consume his face. "Please," Trevor begged, hot tears streaming down his pale cheeks. He dropped heavily to his knees, forcing the two officers to hold him up by his armpits. "Please have mercy on me. You cannot send me to federal prison. I'm your son." The entire living room held its breath. The wealthy guests, the catering staff, The security contractors and the police detectives all waited in total silence to see how I would respond to his desperate begging plea. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling on the floor. I looked at the exact spot on the rug where my beautiful wife had bled for 3 hours, while he laughed and drank my expensive wine. "My son died the moment he stepped over his bleeding mother," I replied. My voice was incredibly soft, but it carried a deadly cold finality that sent a visible shiver through the silent crowd. I told him that the man kneeling in front of me was nothing but a thief who broke into my home, and that he was going to spend the rest of his miserable life locked inside a concrete cage. Trevor let out a loud, gut-wrenching scream of pure, absolute despair. It was the sound of a man who finally realized there was no escape, no secret bailout, and no forgiveness waiting for him. The police officers hauled him up roughly by his shoulders and dragged him out of the living room. I stood in the center of my home and watched as the blue uniforms escorted all 4 of the parasites out through the heavy front doors. The flashing police lights illuminated their terrified faces one last time before the heavy wooden doors slammed shut, sealing their fate completely. The silent adjustment was finally over, and the toxic infection had been permanently removed from my life. 3 months passed since that night. The seasons changed, and the crisp autumn air turned into a bitter, freezing winter. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute deep freeze Curtis and I brought down upon my former family inside the federal courthouse. The criminal justice system is usually a slow, grinding machine, but when you hand a federal prosecutor a silver platter loaded with high-definition video evidence, forged real estate deeds, and a perfectly documented trail of stolen money, the wheels of justice spin with terrifying speed. Curtis built an airtight, inescapable vault of evidence. There were no plea deals offered. There was no mercy granted. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom on the day of their sentencing. I wore the same dark navy suit I had worn on the night of the party. I wanted them to look back and remember the exact moment their lives ended. Trevor and Vanessa sat at the defense table, wearing matching oversized orange jumpsuits. The expensive cashmere sweaters and emerald green designer dresses were gone forever. Trevor looked hollowed out. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his hands trembled constantly as they rested on the heavy wooden table. Vanessa kept her head bowed, her hair unwashed and tangled, crying softly into a crumpled tissue. They looked exactly like what they were, 2 pathetic, greedy criminals who had finally run out of other people to exploit. When the federal judge took his seat, the entire courtroom fell perfectly silent. He did not waste any time. He looked down at my son from his high bench with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The judge stated that in his 20 years on the bench, he had rarely seen a case of such callous, calculated evil. He recounted how they left my wife bleeding on the floor to orchestrate a massive financial heist. He read their text messages out loud for the court record, exposing their greedy, selfish jokes about my wife dying. He did not mince his words. He sentenced Trevor to 12 years in federal prison for massive wire fraud and felony elder endangerment. Vanessa received a 10-year sentence for her direct role in the conspiracy and her complete depraved indifference to human life. Because it was a federal conviction, there was no possibility of early parole. They would serve every single day of those sentences. When the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, Vanessa let out a loud, agonizing wail. She tried to turn around and look at me, begging with her eyes, but the federal marshals grabbed her by the arms. They were led out of the courtroom in heavy chains. Trevor did not even look back at me. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, finally crushed by the massive weight of his own arrogant choices. The heavy doors closed behind them, erasing them from my life completely. But the legal annihilation did not stop with my son and his wife. Gerald and Marlene thought they could play the innocent victims. They tried to hire a sleazy defense attorney to argue they were just naive guests who had no idea the power of attorney was forged. They claimed they were manipulated by Trevor and knew nothing about the Phantom Real Estate Trust. But Curtis was a predator who never left a job half-finished. He unleashed a brutal civil litigation lawsuit alongside the federal criminal charges. During the sworn depositions, Curtis dismantled Gerald completely. He presented signed documents and email chains proving that Gerald actively participated in the creation of the trust and fully intended to profit from my stolen estate. Gerald sweat through his cheap suit, stuttering and contradicting himself, until his own lawyer forced him to stop talking. The civil court judge was completely ruthless. He stripped Gerald and Marlene of every single asset they owned, to pay full restitution for the money Trevor had already burned through. I sat in Curtis's office and watched the legal execution happen in real time. Their bank accounts were frozen and drained. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed right out of their driveway. The expensive condominium they rented was cleared out. The diamond necklace Marlene wore on the night of the party was seized by federal marshals to repay the funds stolen from my retirement accounts. They were left absolutely destitute. They were forced to move into a cheap, dirty roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. But the worst part for them was still coming. By completely bankrupting them in civil court, Curtis ensured they could not afford private legal representation for their upcoming criminal trials. They were now relying on overworked public defenders to fight the looming fraud charges that would inevitably send them to the same concrete cages as their daughter. They wanted to steal a $1.2 million estate and live like royalty. Now they were waiting in line at the public assistance office, terrified of the prison sentences hanging over their heads. The entire fraudulent empire they had built collapsed into a pile of worthless dust. I did not feel a single drop of pity for them. They had gambled with my wife's life, and they had lost absolutely everything. The millions of dollars they tried to steal were safely returned to my accounts, secured behind impenetrable legal trusts that Curtis drafted personally. The parasites had been completely eradicated from my financial bloodline. The justice was swift, absolute, and completely merciless. Walking out of the federal courthouse that afternoon, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my shoulders. The cold winter air felt incredibly refreshing against my face. Curtis stood beside me on the concrete steps, closing his heavy leather briefcase with a satisfying snap. We shook hands in silence, knowing that we had executed the perfect operation. We had not just won a court case. We had completely erased a toxic infection from my family tree. I got into my car and drove away from the downtown legal district, leaving the courthouse and all the ugly memories behind me forever. I was finally free to focus entirely on the only thing that truly mattered in this world. The seasons changed again, bringing a warm and vibrant spring to the city. My wife Eleanor made a recovery that was the most beautiful and agonizing process I have ever witnessed. She spent months in the rehabilitation clinic, fighting through the immense physical pain of her shattered hip. I sat by her side every single day, watching her push herself beyond her limits during physical therapy. She had to relearn how to walk, how to balance, and how to trust her own body again. There were days when she cried out of pure frustration, but she never once gave up. The doctors called her progress a medical miracle, but I knew the absolute truth. It was not a miracle. It was the stubborn resilience of a woman who refused to let greed and evil win. When the day finally came for her to be discharged, she walked out of those double-glass doors, leaning lightly on a custom silver cane, with her head held incredibly high. We did not go back to the sprawling suburban estate. I made a solemn promise to myself that Eleanor would never have to cross that threshold again. I could never let her look at the bottom of that grand oak staircase and relive the darkest hours of her life. I moved us into a gorgeous temporary rental property on the quiet side of town, while I handled the final remaining piece of our tragic past. I returned to our old neighborhood one last time to meet with a premium real estate broker. Walking through those empty, echoing rooms felt completely surreal. The house was scrubbed clean, but I could still feel the lingering shadows of my former family. The kitchen, where they drank my wine while my wife suffered, felt like a cold, sterile tomb. The master bedroom, where the greedy in-laws had tried to stake their claim, looked like nothing more than a hollow square of drywall and paint. It was no longer the sanctuary we had built with love. It was a monument to the ultimate betrayal. I told the broker to list the property immediately. It sold in less than a week to a lovely young couple looking to start their own journey. I signed the heavy stack of closing documents, left the keys on the marble kitchen island, and walked out the front door for the very last time. I did not look back. I did not shed a single tear. With the toxic memories completely purged from our lives, I turned my attention to the future. I wanted to give Eleanor a home that represented absolute peace and unshakable security. We did not need 5 empty bedrooms or a massive yard anymore. We needed a fortress where we could finally rest. After weeks of searching, I found the absolute perfect sanctuary. I purchased a stunning luxury penthouse on the very top floor of an exclusive oceanfront building. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a completely unobstructed view of the endless blue ocean. Best of all, the entire penthouse was designed on one single level. There were no grand staircases to fall down. There were no hidden dangers. A private elevator opened directly into our foyer, providing a level of security that ensured no unwanted visitors could ever reach us. The transition into our new home felt like waking up from a long, terrible nightmare and stepping directly into a bright, warm dream. We filled the wide-open spaces with new, comfortable furniture and beautiful art. We did not bring a single piece of the old life with us. We left the heavy, dark memories behind and surrounded ourselves with light. The ocean breeze blew continuously through the open windows, carrying the fresh, clean scent of salt water into every single room. It washed away the lingering stress and the deep sorrow we had carried for months. We hired a private chef to cook our meals, and we spent our mornings drinking coffee while watching the sailboats glide across the horizon. Tonight, Eleanor and I are sitting outside on our sprawling private balcony, watching the sun melt into the water. The sky is painted in brilliant shades of gold and deep purple. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing waves below serves as a constant reminder that life continues to move forward. Eleanor looks absolutely radiant in the soft evening light. The physical scars from her fall have faded into faint lines, and the emotional wounds have hardened into an impenetrable armor. I pour us both a glass of beautiful vintage wine from a bottle I bought simply because I wanted to enjoy it. There is no one hiding in the kitchen. There is no one scheming to steal our wealth. The money I worked 40 years to accumulate is now entirely ours to enjoy in absolute complete peace. We survived the worst betrayal a parent could ever face. We looked pure evil right in the eye, and we dismantled it piece by piece. The dead weight of a parasitic son and his toxic, greedy universe has been completely cut loose and cast into the abyss. We are finally free. I raise my glass to the beautiful woman sitting beside me, and she smiles a genuine bright smile. The silent adjustment is officially complete. The greatest lesson I learned from this agonizing journey is that blood does not automatically define a family. We are taught to forgive and protect our relatives, no matter what they do. But true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and unconditional care. When someone weaponizes your love and views your generosity as a weakness, you owe them absolutely nothing. Protecting your own peace and your own dignity is never a selfish act. It is a necessary survival skill. Do not ever let the title of family blind you to the reality of toxic behavior. If you found value in this story of survival and ultimate justice, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons.